computer. Okay, so shalom, everyone. Usually I start Shabbat Shalom, but it's not Shabbat, so I'm not going to do that. But shalom, happy Sunday, Shavua Tov to everyone. I have the pleasure today of being joined by Professor David Hirsh. David Hirsh has been in the sociology department at Goldsmiths since 2003. He studied sociology at City University London, did an MA in philosophy and social theory at Warwick, and wrote his PhD there on crimes against humanity and international law. David's book on contemporary left anti-Semitism came out in September of 2017 and is still very timely and is the topic of our conversation today. We're going to be talking about a number of different things related to the topic of anti-Semitism today, and specifically to contemporary left anti-Semitism. So welcome. I'm glad you're able to join me today for our conversation.
Hi.
So I think the place to start is probably the place that you start in your book, which is the Livingston formulation.
Right.
And tell us a little bit about the Livingston formulation and how that plays into the whole idea.
Okay. Well, the story of the Livingston formulation is quite strange, really, in itself. Ken Livingstone was the mayor of London right back in 2006. He was kind of well known and well loved. He himself had been involved in anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic politics already for some time, but it wasn't really well known or well understood. Ken Livingstone got involved in a really absurd little argument outside a party, actually. It was late at night. He says he wasn't drunk to this day. A reporter went to him, and in fact, I happen to know that the reporter had been told by Livingstone's people that he'd get a quote, right? So the reporter went to Livingstone and said, "How was the party?" And Livingstone kind of ranted at him and said, "Oh, go away, I'm not going to talk to you, blah, blah, blah." And the journalist said, "Come on, just give me a quote." And Livingstone ranted again, and the journalist said, "Look, I'm just doing my job. I'm a journalist, give me a quote, and then we can all go home." And Livingstone turned on him and said, "Oh, you're just like a German concentration camp guard." And the journalist said, "Don't be silly. You know, this is my job. I'm only doing my job. Give me a quote, we can go home." And he said, "By the way, I'm Jewish and I don't like to be likened to a concentration camp guard because I'm a journalist." And Livingstone ranted more and more about how his newspaper supported the Nazis in the 1930s and blah, 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 blah. So that's the end of the story, right? They go home. Livingstone wakes up in the morning with a sore head and he says, "Oh dear, that must have all been caught on tape." And he says, "Oh my gosh, what a fool I've been. I have to send a bunch of flowers to this journalist and apologize." But he didn't. What he did instead was wrote an article for The Guardian and said, "You know, I always get accused of anti-Semitism because I'm critical of the government of Israel." That's what he said. And I remember seeing this and thinking, I've seen this before, right? Now, obviously, in this case, it was nothing to do with Israel. It was a late night rant where he was, relentlessly accusing some Jewish journalist of being a Nazi for really no reason. But I was thinking, I've heard this before, I've heard it many times, and it is a kind of standard response. If you say, and this is, particularly within democratic society, democratic organizations on the left, if you say, "I experience what you're saying as anti-Semitic. I think the campaign to exclude Israelis from global civil society has a problem with anti-Semitism. I think that you supported the mural which showed anti-Semitic caricatures and you pretended it was anti-capitalist." Or if you say you supported a Palestinian speaker who had been responsible for the blood libel, whatever it is. If you raise the issue of anti-Semitism, the standard response is to say, it's not true, and I know why you're saying that, right? You're not saying that because you believe it. You're not saying that because you think there's an issue of anti-Semitism here, but you're saying that in order to silence criticism of Israel, and you're saying that in order to smear the left. So this standard form, which I, at that moment, kind of clicked in my head, this is what Livingston's doing, and I gave it the name, the Livingston formulation, and this is a standard form of absolute denial of any claim of anti-Semitism and a counter-accusation, really, of conspiracy. And it doesn't say you've made a mistake, right? Hey, Jewish person, you've made a mistake. You've accused me of anti-Semitism when really all I'm doing is something else. It's not that. What it is, it says, hey, Jewish person, I know what you're really up to. And what you're really up to is trying to silence criticism of Israel and to delegitimize it as though it was anti-Semitism. So the reason that I recognized this and the reason I gave it a name is because it seems to me very, very important. It's the kind of standard response, and it's amazingly kind of, it's amazingly dispiriting, right? When you quite honestly trying to raise an issue that you think is important, and anti-Semitism is important, and you raise an issue that you think is important, and you say, I think what you just did was anti-Semitic, and I feel that it was anti-Semitic, and I have experienced this as anti-Semitism, and the answer is, you're lying. You know it's not anti-Semitic, but you're pretending, and you're doing it for an ulterior motive that's to do with Jewish power. So it is really, really the key form of bullying of anyone who tries to have a proper discussion about anti-Semitism on the left. And it precludes a proper discussion. So it makes a proper discussion impossible. Because if you were to have a proper discussion, I would say that I feel your attempt to exclude Israeli scholars from my campus is anti-Semitic. And you'd say, oh, that's interesting that you should feel like that, but I think it's really important for this, and that reason. And the moment you say, we can have a discussion, we can give reasons, we can give arguments, then we're on the terrain of democratic politics. But the moment you say, you're a liar, you're pretending to be a proper academic, when really you're a kind of representative of the Zionist entity or the Israeli embassy, and you're not really an academic at all, but you're representing some kind of foreign, racist, imperialist movement here on campus or in the party. And just, I know I'm speaking a lot, but the final point about this and the way that this particular kind of bullying works is that it excludes you from the community, right? As I say, if I'm in a Labour Party meeting and I say, there's a problem with this and this that Jeremy Corbyn has done, we can then debate it. But if you say to me, ha, you're a liar, I know what you're really trying to do, you're really trying to hurt the Labour Party. And I say, but hang on, I'm a member of the Labour Party. And they say, no, not really. Really, you're some kind of Trumpist or Tory or right-winger or imperialist who's pretending to be within this community of the trade union or academia or the Labour Party, but really we know that you're not for real and you don't belong. And so this is how Jews and really anyone who raises the issue of anti-Semitism gets excluded from the community and made politically homeless.
Well, and you also have the history of excluding Jews by arguing that Jews aren't resident in wherever, Jews are resident wherever they are, but they're not necessarily part of the nation. That was a long time criticism. And just as you were saying this, it kind of connected to me that it's very similar. You're not a part of our group because you're always other, no matter what you say, right? Yeah. So I mean that is kind of at the basis of the whole anti-Semitism discussion when we're talking about Jews as an other people.
To be
So
made homeless, to be
yeah,
made homeless is, you know, completely in keeping with the whole history of many, many different anti-Semitisms.
yeah,
So you can only make your home in this ghetto, or you lose your citizenship, you're not really a member of the nation,
mm,
or you pretend to be a loyal army officer, but really you're a German spy. So this kind of accusation that you don't belong, and this making of you homeless, making of Jews into refugees, in fact, um, resonates with people being made homeless from the communities which they're in, such as academia, such as the Labour Party, such as the left. And you know, actually, I mean, for sure it's an analogy, right? An analogy between being excluded from certain communities that we're in and being actually made homeless. But if you look at the history of Jews 100 years ago, Jews didn't live where they live today, right? Today they live in North America and they live in Israel, right? Basically, you know, there are other Jewish communities. Everybody will tell me I've forgotten them, in Australia and South Africa and Europe. Fundamentally, Jews live in America and in Israel. And 100 years ago, they didn't. 100 years ago, fundamentally, they lived in the great cities of the Middle East and in Eastern and Central Europe and in Russia. So homelessness is really, really important. And I use the analogy advisedly.
yeah. Well, so we're talking about. Let's go back to the Labor Party specifically, because that's where your book goes, and I want to try to keep us somewhat structured here because we could go pretty far afield pretty quickly. So um, let's talk about Jeremy Corbyn and the Labor Party specifically, both kind of what happened, how it developed into a problem, and then we can talk about the immediate news of his readmission into the Labor Party after being
Yeah.
suspended.
Well, when I talk about my book, my book really is the story of the mainstreaming of this kind of anti-Semitism. So my own experience of it started really in the mid 1980s in student politics. And this was shortly after, do you remember in the United Nations, there was the motion passed which said Zionism equals racism. And in the 80s, in the student movement, some people on the left were trying to exclude Jewish societies, Hillels, from campus, and to say that Hillels are Zionist and therefore they're racist and therefore they cannot be part of the student community. So this was my experience in the 1980s, but this was marginal, right? I was in a Trotskyist group. Other people were in Trotskyist and Stalinist groups, and we did politics very much on the margins. It wasn't even in the mainstream of the student movement, really, and it wasn't in the mainstream of politics. It wasn't in the mainstream of the trade unions or the country. So my book really is the story of how this kind of anti-Semitism, this kind of exclusion of Jews as Zionists, therefore as racist and supporters of apartheid, went from the very margins of politics right into the center. And in the book, it happened. I mean, there's a moment that I think is really interesting in 2001, which is the moment of what might turn out to have been the end of the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's also the moment of Durban, when there was this huge NGO conference and governmental conference in the new South Africa about how we're going to fight racism in the world after the fall of apartheid. And there was a really successful campaign to designate Zionism as the key racism on the planet in Durban in 2001. And a week later, I mean, lots of the delegates to Durban, having experienced a kind of astonishingly anti-Semitic environment with political anti-Semitism at Durban, a week later they couldn't get home because there was a cloud over lower Manhattan. A week later was 9/11. So that was a moment, 2001. And in my experience, we then had the boycott campaign move into I then was by then an academic. We had the campaign to boycott Israeli scholars from our campuses and our journals and our conferences in about 2004, 2005. And we found that very important because we said if we lose against this kind of politics now, it will spread. And we did lose, and it did spread. And we couldn't have lost worse, actually. And to my surprise, I thought this is going to be kind of fun. I thought we know how to win this. We'll make a few arguments and we'll bring people with us, but we didn't. And in the years following that, it moved into the union with the boycott campaign, BDS campaign, into the trade unions. And then by a strange kind of coming together of different stories, suddenly this particular kind of Stalinist left politics became mainstream in the British Labour Party, partly as part of a process that you could see coming since 2001, but also partly through a kind of mad strangeness, also then connected to something that you know well about in America at the moment, the rise of right-wing populism, and we had the rise of Brexit populism. And in my view, the left populism kind of is a twin, and it kind of feeds on right-wing populism. So for various reasons, Jeremy Corbyn and his faction came to power in the British Labour Party in 2015. And again, you know, we were there to say, this man has a long history of anti-Semitic politics. He's, you know, participated in the Cairo conference about how the Arab states should annihilate Israel. He's worked for the Iranian government in their English language propaganda TV channel, Press TV, and he's been paid for it. He's sided with anti-Semites against Jews in a whole number of cases, A, B, C, D, E, we can name them. He's laid a wreath at the grave of the man responsible for organizing the attack on the Munich Olympics in 1972. We were there in 2015. We were there with all these stories, and people saw Jeremy Corbyn and they said, hang on, he looks like a nice guy. And he looks like he's representing something new, you know, the politics that defends the poor, the politics that is against the which is for the 99% and against the 1% and all that. And he seems like a lovely granddad, and people could not compute. They thought it can't really be true. So the story goes on to, well, the populist right in Britain began to become powerful and eventually went into government. Corbyn did fairly well in a general election. And then this time last year, in December last year, there was his second general election that in the end he lost by a long way. And that's why we were left with the kind of right-wing Brexit government, which has quite a lot in common with your Trump movement. It's a kind of government which opposes international structures and international organizations. It's a government which makes propaganda against immigration and which treats migrants as though they're some kind of enemy. It's a government which tries to create a sort of economic nationalism. And people voted for that because they were, in the end, convinced that Corbyn was worse. So Corbyn was defeated. Corbyn eventually resigned as the leader of the Labour Party, was finished. We have a new leader called Keir Starmer. One of the things that happened, interestingly, for me personally, that it was quite a kind of interesting and moving experience. Let me say that right back in our fight in the trade unions, in the academic trade unions, after we were defeated when we tried to oppose the anti-Semitism that came with the boycott campaign into our union, it kind of all ended up in court. And there was a union member called Ronnie Fraser, who in the end went to court, and he said the things we experienced in the union were anti-Semitic. And there was an array of about 30 academics, members of the union, who went to court and explained to the judge what we'd experienced, mainly around what I was talking about before, around the Livingston formulation, around the counter accusation that we weren't real trade unionists, we weren't real academics, we were agents of a foreign power, and we were trying to mobilize power against having the voice of the Palestinians heard, which of course none of it was true. Anyway, as I said before, we lost, and we lost in court. And in fact, the judgment in the Fraser Tribunal right back in, I think it was 2011, the judgment itself said that this is a tribunal which is supposed to be here to protect people from racism. But you lot have used this tribunal to try and defend Israeli imperialism, right?
So the Whittaker's formulation in a
correct. I mean, it didn't use the word imperialism, but it said it was a misuse of this court to come to this court talking about racism and anti-Semitism, when really what you meant to do was to relitigate the Israel-Palestine conflict. So you're right, the judgment itself was a Livingston formulation judgment. And the reason I mention that is because there was so what's just happened is in a sense something very similar, that the Jewish Labour Movement, which is the organization of Jews within the Labour Party, alongside actually other organizations which fight anti-Semitism, put together a case, not to go to court this time, but to go to the what's it called, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, the EHRC. And the EHRC is a statutory body that was set up with the Equality Act of 2010 to protect equality legislation and the equality situation in Britain. So they took this case to the EHRC, and it's unprecedented. The EHRC doesn't take up a case unless there's very good evidence to do so. It took up this case. The Jewish Labour Movement took literally hundreds of examples of anti-Semitism by the Labour Party itself, within the machine of the Labour Party, by members of the Labour Party, by supporters of the Labour Party. And there were many hundreds of other examples of anti-Semitism from other campaigns. We waited a long time for this judgment. And finally, actually, we got the judgment that we think that we really deserved. And kind of amazingly, the judgment said, I'm going to put this on my screen actually, because I'm going to quote you the bit that was interesting, particularly for me. The judgment talked about two forms of anti-Semitism in particular. And it said that the second one was this, was suggesting that complaints of anti-Semitism are fake or smears. Labour Party agents denied anti-Semitism in the party and made comments dismissing complaints as smears and fake. This conduct may target Jewish members as deliberately making up anti-Semitism complaints in order to undermine the Labour Party, and ignores legitimate and genuine complaints of anti-Semitism in the party. So what the judgment itself did was to say that this counter-accusation of Jewish conspiracy is itself anti-Semitic. And so the story then is quite interesting. See, the jury's a little bit out with Keir Starmer, with the new leader. He's got a lot of goodwill and he says a lot of the right things. And an hour after this EHRC report had been published, Jeremy Corbyn himself pops up on Facebook and he says, the scale of the problem of anti-Semitism was dramatically overstated for political reasons by our opponents inside and outside the party, as well as by much of the media. In other words, Jeremy Corbyn immediately repeats the thing that the EHRC had just said was the key mode of anti-Semitic bullying. So what happened, to all of our surprise really, was that Jeremy Corbyn was immediately suspended from membership of the party. And wow, you know, Keir Starmer seemed to have moved very quickly. And then what happened, I don't know what it was, 2 weeks later, kind of equally bizarre, was that one of the committees of the Labour Party managed to get together a structure by which they were able to undo the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn and bring him back to the party. So then the headline was Jeremy Corbyn's suspension is undone and he's a member of the party again. And then Keir Starmer, the leader, he said, interestingly, actually, he said, we've promised an independent complaints process. He said, therefore, I can't intervene. Therefore, he said, what I'm going to do is fix the independent complaints process. And when it's fixed early in the new year, then things will be better. And he also did what they called, he removed the whip from Jeremy Corbyn. So Keir Starmer has power in Parliament over Labour MPs, and he said Corbyn's not a Labour MP. The committee said he is a member of the Labour Party. Many of us felt that he should actually have been tougher, but other people say that he's being very smart and clever and procedural. He's a lawyer. And so we'll see how that goes.
Okay. It is interesting to me to hear how the Labour Party went from a Tony Blair party to a Jeremy Corbyn party. And that was one of the questions that I had, looking at developments in our own politics here and the polarization of both parties. How did that happen there? How did the Labour Party go from Tony Blair, who was interested in making peace in Israel and was, essentially a Zionist and still is working on peace process stuff, to Corbyn, who's hostile?
Right. Well, Tony Blair is the only leader of the Labour Party in the era of colour television to have won a general election. Just think about that. Actually, when Harold Wilson won in 1974, some of rich people had colour television, so it's a little bit of an exaggeration. Fundamentally, he's the only leader of the Labour Party to have won a general election since colour television, and he's done it 3 times, right? So obviously, it follows that people in the Labour Party hate him, right? You just know how this goes. And he's very much hated because of the Iraq War, which, we could get into if we wanted, but the story of actually the idea of an international community which intervenes when, huge crimes against humanity are happening around the world is actually rather important. And there were many things wrong with the Gulf War, the Iraq War, which I won't get into. But we could get into it, and the reason we could get into it is because part of the politics, which became the problem, and part of Corbyn's politics, comes out of that tradition, which divides the world into good and bad, into what it says really is look. Keep your eye on the ball, right? What's really evil on our planet, the really bad thing on our planet, the thing that causes war and inequality and poverty and hunger, the really bad thing on our planet is what you might call modernity or capitalism or imperialism, right? Give it whatever name you like. It's a global machine and it hurts people. And therefore, anyone who says that they're against modernity, capitalism, imperialism is in some sense on our side. And you'll remember, I don't know if everybody has heard of Judith Butler, a very famous and well-respected philosopher, was talking about Hezbollah at one point as being part of the global left. And people said, well, hang on, how can Hezbollah, which is an anti-Semitic organization, a murderous organization which has committed a lot of the crimes on behalf of the Assad regime in Syria over the last 5 years, how can you say that these killers and anti-Semites are part of the left? And Judith Butler said, oh no, I didn't mean any of that. All I meant was that they stand with us against imperialism. And of course, in this context, what imperialism tends to mean in practice is the democratic states, right? Is the United States of America, Europe, the democratic states, and they are kind of portrayed as the root of all evil across the planet. And then there's one more step, right? Because once you've divided the world into two, into good and bad is, you know, democracy, modernity, capitalism, which you call imperialism, you still have to understand why Israel gets this kind of central symbolic role at the heart of this whole machine. And it's actually a really difficult question to answer. Why does Israel, and to an extent the United States, the big Satan and the little Satan, as the Shia Islamists in Iran would call them, the big Satan and the little Satan, how does America and Israel become the symbolic focus of everything bad in the world? And then it becomes modernity, capitalism, imperialism, and Zionism, right? So there's kind of two steps. So that politics was normalized. It was normalized on campus. It was normalized, but not only in the kind of narrow anti-Zionist sense, but a whole set of politics which were contemptuous of democracy, right? If you even look at what Donald Trump says, you know, Donald Trump refers to the to freedom of speech, to the media as fake news, right? That the media becomes some kind of conspiracy to lie on behalf of a liberal elite which really runs the world with its globalist tentacles against the interests of people in the Rust Belt in Michigan and in Iowa and in the north of England. And so these ideas came from the left, and they came from scholarship. We've been teaching in our departments for decades that knowledge is power, and that the media is set up to defend the interests of the capitalist class, and that democracy is kind of fake, is kind of a mirage to hide the exploitation of the masses. And all of these kind of ideas of populist politics, of anti-democratic politics. And you might be thinking, and if you are, you'd be right, we've seen this kind of anti-democratic radical politics before. And there's quite a lot in common between the populist movements of today's left and today's right, and the 20th century totalitarian movements, which ended up causing so much pain and misery and disruption.
Well, and connected to that, you have the United States, Russia, United States, Soviet Union, capitalist versus socialist and communist conflicts, right?
Well, yes. I mean, that was one of the ways in which this division of the world into two started. It wasn't kind of accidental, right? It started as Russia is good because it's socialist, it's had a revolution, there's something worth defending, we have to defend against imperialist attack. And after a certain point, everybody realized that there was nothing left to defend. There was nothing good about Russia, but there remained the evil of the imperialist attack. So instead of defending socialism against imperialist attack, it became defending anybody at all who said that they were opposing imperialism. And that included defending, for example, the Iranian Revolution against American imperialism. It included even defending the Milosevic ethnic cleansing regime in Serbia against, you know, NATO imperialism. So the kind of anti-imperialism that began as a defense of socialism was then developed actually by the KGB, amongst other people. You know, we look at Russian interference in politics and Russian attempts, kind of Russian secret police attempts to change how people think. Well, the Russians have been developing institutions to do this for a century, right? And the KGB wasn't bad at it. The KGB was not too bad at inventing this story that Zionism was a particular evil on the planet, particularly connected and part of and symbolic of this global system of imperialism. And Zionism was like apartheid South Africa, that came from the KGB. So a lot of the people who talk in these kind of general terms and with these general principles, they do not know who invented these ideas and why. I remember, I mean, I remember when we were fighting the boycott in the trade union, in the academic unions, a Polish academic who I'm kind of in touch with to this day wrote to me and said, this reminds me of the attacks against Jews in Poland in 1968. And I confess that as a proper Western lefty, I hadn't heard of it. And what happened in 1968 was that, and think about it, 1968 is, what is it, 24 years after the concentration camps in Poland organized by the Nazi regime in Germany went cold. 23 years later, and there's a campaign in communist Poland and communist East Germany against Zionism as imperialism, and any of the Jews who were left in positions of power or influence were challenged to disavow their Zionism. And there was a purge of Jews in Poland and East Germany in 1968 on that basis. So it's interesting because what we know is that this kind of anti-Zionist politics was actually invented as an anti-Semitic politics, right? Quite consciously was invented as an anti-Semitic politics. In 1956 in Czechoslovakia, sorry, not 56, 51 in Czechoslovakia, Rudolf Slansky and 11 of the other leaders of the Communist Party were hung, and they were accused of bourgeois Jewish nationalism and Zionism, which was a crime, and they were hung for it. The leadership of Communist Czechoslovakia were hung, and Slansky was tortured, and on the stand in 1951 at his show trial, he was forced to confess that he had falsely accused good patriotic Czechs of being anti-Semitic because they supported the campaign against Zionism. So in 1951, in the show trial, you had the Livingston formulation. So I'm not saying that all of the people who fall into anti-Semitic politics of this type today know what it is they're falling into. They clearly don't. And they're clearly not generally motivated by anti-Semitism. It's not a kind of wish to hide their anti-Semitism under a cloak of anti-Zionism. They simply do not know that this is where their politics comes from. And they do not know that there's another provenance of this politics, which is, of course, Islamist politics, not the politics of Islam, but the politics which takes Islam and makes out of it a totalitarian movement, you know, pushed and created by people like Qutb in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in the 20s, and by Husseini in the Mufti of Jerusalem, who went to Berlin and broadcast Nazi propaganda into the Middle East on behalf of Adolf Hitler. The point is their anti-Zionism and their anti-imperialism, at least their anti-imperialist rhetoric, was quite similar. And of course, as was Hitler's own, right? Hitler also made rhetoric against actually English-speaking imperialism, against British and American imperialism. And he said that the Jews were behind it, pulling the strings, puppet masters, and all the rest of it. And every time you see a cartoon which portrays Jews as puppet masters or portrays George Soros as being behind everything. In fact, Rudy Giuliani did this just the other day. I think not at his press conference in the Garden Center, but another one of his press conferences. Rudy Giuliani was blaming George Soros for trying to steal the election in the United States of America. And George Soros, whatever you think of the actuality of George Soros, is kind of divorced from the way in which his name is used, which is that he's used as the new Rothschilds. And of course, the Rothschilds themselves, I mean, they probably weren't saints. You know, they were a banking family and they did all sorts of things that we might not like. But the Rothschilds and Soros became this code word for this liberal, global, fake, international power which controls governments against the interests of the people.
Well, and it can work in both directions. So it's even more problematic because you could have the Jews as representing the socialist communist side, or the Jews as representing the capitalist side against the socialist communist side. So you have both. You have both the Corbinites who put the Jewish Zionists on the capitalist side, and you have the people on the conservative side arguing that that Soros is representing the Jewish people is in front of that.
Yes, I think that's true. Although I think the kind of the distinction between left and right populism, left and right anti-Semitism, is sometimes quite hard to kind of keep your fingers on. That quite often the right and sometimes quite often you'll meet someone who doesn't know whether they're on the left or they're on the right, or you don't know, you know, when they start railing against the fake news and the media and the, you know, the vaccinations and Soros and globalism, you don't really know if they're on the left or the right, because some of the rhetoric becomes very similar, and some of this kind of fundamental idea that there is the people who have been fooled by this liberal global capitalist financier, big tech, big pharma elite, and they live in the cities and they're highly educated and they are cosmopolitan and metropolitan and liberal. And anyone who knows anything about the history of anti-Semitism knows that once you describe the enemy in those terms, then you're a paper width away from falling into anti-Semitic conspiracy fantasy.
Well, let's talk about academics now. We've touched on it a little bit here, but I want to get to it kind of more specifically. I think we have way more material than we have for one session here. That's the first thing. But let's talk a little bit about academics and college campuses and BDS movement and all of that.
Okay. Well, we've talked a little bit about it, about how it emerged really in England, actually, in 2004, the movement to boycott Israeli academics. What that means, of course, is that our campuses here in Britain should exclude Israelis and not anyone else, not, you know, Pakistanis or Indians or Iranians or Russians or Americans, no one else, but we should exclude Israelis. And you can argue, and there are arguments about the fact that that in itself is a kind of anti-Semitic exclusion. But even if that particular argument is inconclusive, what you can see is that when these campaigns to exclude Israelis come into our democratic spaces, they bring with them anti-Semitism. They bring with them immense hostility. Because to make people vote to exclude, you have to make them angry. And who are they angry with? They're angry, first of all, with this idea of Zionism, which is kind of only very tenuously connected to actual Zionism. I mean, you know, people have every right to be angry with this or that the Israeli government does or doesn't do. But what happens is that this idea of exclusion and this campaign to exclude becomes symbolic of much, much more in our world. And it becomes symbolic on a very emotional level. I was involved in a court case actually in San Francisco last year, in which it was actually, interestingly, at the very beginning of the Trump era. So Donald Trump won the election, and students at San Francisco State University got together and they said we should have an event to inform students of their rights. You know, if there are students who may not have citizenship, or students who may be Muslim, or students who may be gay or Mexican, or we should make sure students know their rights, because we don't know what kind of attacks are coming from the Trump government. And Hillel phoned them up and said, of course, we'd like to support this because we're worried about anti-Semitism. We'd like to be part of this. And they said, sorry, we're full. And Hillel said, what do you mean you're full? We'd just like a table at this event. We'd like to be part of the event. And if we're going to build, you know, a movement to defend students' rights against something that that might threaten them, we're part of it. And they said, no, you're not. You're part of the Trump movement, not part of the movement against the Trump movement. Again, it's the Livingston formulation. It's, you might pretend that you want to stand alongside lesbian and gay students and trans students and Muslim students, but we know the truth. The truth is that you don't. So having said there's no room, and then they said, we're not having you. And actually these particular students took them to court in San Francisco and in fact won most of what they were looking for in that case. But the story I thought was really interesting, because what it does is it takes this idea of siding with the Palestinians and Palestinian rights, it takes that idea and makes it into an anti-Semitic movement. And, you know, it needn't. Of course, there's nothing necessary about standing with Palestinians and campaigning for their rights, which must become anti-Semitic, and it shouldn't, and it doesn't have to, but very often it does. And one of the ways it's almost guaranteed to do so is through campaigns of exclusion, campaigns to exclude Israeli scholars, scientists, sports people, business people, to exclude them from the global community of humanity in order to teach the government a lesson. Normally, if you want to have a campaign against the government, you have a campaign against the government. You don't have a campaign against the people. Normally, the government is held responsible, but here, every Israeli is held responsible and is punished. And not only that, but then you have people who oppose this kind of politics and who say, I don't like some of the anti-Semitism that comes with this politics. I don't like the exclusion. And then they become targeted as protectors of Israel, defenders of imperialism and all the rest of it. And of course, very often they're Jews, right? So the anti-Semitism doesn't target Israelis first. It targets people here in British campuses, in American campuses, in American food co-ops, wherever it is. It targets people here who say we should support Palestinian rights and we should support a democratic, sovereign, independent Palestine, but we shouldn't create a movement which would exclude Israelis and only Israelis from our spaces. And those people then get targeted. And by the way, just to finish this point, the other people who get targeted the first by the academic boycott campaign are always Palestinians, right? Palestinians who have academic links with Israeli institutions, Palestinians who work with Israeli colleagues. They're always the first ones to be targeted. And when they get targeted in Palestine, that's not a game. That's quite serious. So the politics of boycott and the politics of exclusion, we have enough experience now to know where it leads. And I can tell you, I mean, it's not surprising that the politics of boycott and exclusion resonate with Jews because Jews have been boycotted and excluded for hundreds and hundreds of years in different ways, in different places, and at different times. I mean, I actually found out about some of my own family in Germany owned a big store in a small town in Bavaria. And I found out quite a lot about this recently. But to cut a long story short, when the Nazis came to power in 1933, they began with a picket of my family's store. And the picket said, don't buy from the Jews. And interestingly, the picket lasted 2 years, right? So people didn't obey this Nazi picket. You know, people said, oh, don't be silly. You know, we'll carry on buying from the Jews if we want to buy from the Jews. And this campaign went on for 2 years until in the end, my great-grandfather was pushed out of Germany and was allowed to go and become a refugee. And people who campaign for the exclusion of Israelis and for the targeting of people who stand by Israelis need to understand that the history of anti-Semitism has thrown up these kinds of movements before. It's not new.
And speaking of it being not new, So we have the definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA definition, which is accepted in a number of different countries now, kind of responding to that. We're just critical of Israel. I'm anti-Zionist, not anti-Semitic kind of argument. What's the impact of that?
Well, again, if you read my book, and people should be buying my book for anyone they know on campus, buy it for Hanukkah, buy it for Christmas, because I'm kind of kidding and I'm pushing my own book, but it really, thank you very much. You've got a green screen so people can only see half of it. Anyway, there is a chapter about the IRA definition, and the story really begins at Durban, which I was talking about earlier on. And at Durban, there was this kind of global coalition against racism, which ended up embracing a kind of anti-Semitic view, which is that at the center of global racism is Zionism and Israel and the Jews who defend it. And many Jewish NGOs were really worried about this right back then in 2001. And they went, a bunch of the NGOs got together and they went into the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and into the European Union. And they said, these issues need to be taken seriously. And they also said at that time, this is just after the end of the Cold War, they said that in Eastern Europe and the newly independent states, we need to be collecting information about anti-Semitism. And some of the policemen in, Azerbaijan and Romania, they said, we don't know what anti-Semitism, we don't know how to measure it. So that's how the working definition was developed. And the working definition, it's not magic, right? It's not a machine that can tell you what is anti-Semitic and what isn't. It's not an app for your phone, right? Which you can plug in an image and say, is this anti-Semitic? What the definition does is it gives you a framework and a set of guidelines which can help you to make a political judgment about whether something's anti-Semitic or not. I mean, think about sexism, right? It's not always easy to know what is sexist and what isn't. And there's discussion about it and disagreement about it, right? But you cannot have a machine to tell you whether a particular joke is sexist. You cannot have a machine to tell you what's anti-Semitic. But what IRA does is it gives you a framework within which helps you to make a judgment. And for that reason, I think it's quite important. And it's really also important negatively, because IRA is important by the people for whom it's really important to disavow. Right? People say, and of course, this is the Livingston formulation again. IRA says these things in certain contexts may be anti-Semitic. And the opponents of IRA says, look what they're doing. They're trying to prohibit criticism of Israel by disguising it as anti-Semitism. So it's the Livingston formulation again, kind of writ large, that governments or other institutions who adopt IRA are said to be part of a conspiracy to silence criticism of Israel. And it's not true. I mean, firstly, it's not illegal to be anti-Semitic, right? So people are not silenced. People can carry on being anti-Semitic, but others have the right to mobilize their own free speech by saying what is anti-Semitic. And that's true of states and of universities and of institutions. But secondly, IRA does not say criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. In fact, IRA says precisely and exactly the opposite. IRA says criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. What is anti-Semitic is anti-Semitism. So, this goes back a long way in the fighting and in the formulations, right? That it was said years ago in one of my union debates, criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. And of course, the answer to that is, well, some kinds of criticism of Israel are anti-Semitic and some kinds of criticism of Israel are not anti-Semitic. Is criticism of Kamala Harris sexist or is it racist? And the answer is some kinds of criticism of Kamala Harris are racist and sexist, and some kinds of criticism of her are not. So again, like I said before, once you admit that we have to get into the specifics of what was said, what is the kind of criticism, and why do you think it might be anti-Semitic or racist or sexist? Once we're into the specifics, then we're back in the realms of rational democratic politics. But while we're still in the criticism is not anti-Semitic, or criticism is anti-Semitic, then there's no rational politics. Do you see what I mean? And so the fights around IRA have really taken that quite familiar form.
Okay, so we have quite a bit more to do, quite a bit more to talk about. I don't think we may need to schedule another conversation here to get to some of it, unless you want to go for a while longer.
Is anybody still watching, David?
There are people watching we have a few watching on Facebook for sure. So I don't know if you want to get into some of these other things, or do you kind of conclude for today and do another one? What's your thought?
Whatever you like. I'm happy. I'm happy to carry on if you want. It's quite nice because I can't see all these people watching. I can only see you, so it's just like me sitting here at my table having a conversation with you. So I'm not too nervous.
Okay, well, we can keep going. I mean, so one of the things that is next in your book, and I think it's important, is getting specifically into Zionism itself and anti-Zionism as a strategy, the existence of Israel, what the nature of Israel should be. There are arguments that people make Jews and Palestinians should coexist in a single state of Palestine. Israel should never have been created. Or now Jews and Palestinians should coexist in a single state of Israel. There are arguments having to do with Israel has no right to defend itself because it's on occupied land, and anybody can fight for anything because they're occupied. So that's the next segment.
Was that a question?
Where do you want to start with that? That's a lot of stuff.
I think, look, firstly, I'm no expert on the politics, on Israeli politics. I'm no expert on Palestinian politics. I don't speak Hebrew. I don't speak Arabic. And that is actually not my area of expertise. My area of expertise is the way in which people talk about and think about Israel and Palestine and the Israeli-Palestine conflict and Zionism outside of Israel and Palestine. And I think it's quite important because many people kind of pose as being expert, and really they're people who don't really know very much about what they're talking about. So that's one point. I'm not here to be expert in Israeli and Palestinian politics or in the conflict. What I do know a little bit about is the word Zionism. So it's quite interesting, actually. I've been an expert witness in a few cases, actually, and quite often people are very keen to find out what Zionism is. They say, what is Zionism really? And everyone, many people who oppose anti-Semitism and who oppose the demonization of Israel, they want to defend some kind of notion of Zionism and say, this is what it really is, and it's not really that. I'm not really able to do that because I'm a sociologist, right? So what I say is I look at the world and I see the word Zionism being used in a whole number of very, very different ways. And you or I or other people, we might well have our own self-empowering identities, one of which might be Zionist. And we might each mean something slightly different when we think of ourselves as Zionist, or we might not think of ourselves as Zionist. There is great plurality in what people mean. But in a sense, none of that is important to me, because in a sense, what is really important is when I get designated as Zionist from outside and in a hostile way and against my will. And what I don't like is when I get designated as Zionist when Zionism means racist, imperialist, pro-apartheid, and supporter of Nazism, right? And anyone who knows about race and racism, actually, right? Race as biological difference between human beings does not exist. Race is invented by racism, right? And again, to make an analogy, you might live with very positive, self-empowering identities of who you are. But if you're walking down the street and a racist gang defines you as black, right? That's a different business. And what happens in this case is that Nick Cohen tells this story, and I've heard this story told by other people actually. Nick Cohen is a journalist in Britain. You might be surprised to learn that Nick Cohen is not Jewish, right? He's called Cohen. He's not Jewish. His dad wasn't Jewish. That obviously somebody was Jewish sometime in the family at some point. Nick Cohen's not Jewish, right? But Nick Cohen is a journalist. And actually going back also to the discussion we had about Tony Blair, Nick Cohen was writing articles in the press. And he used to get responses which said, we know what you're doing. We know who you are. We know why you're supporting Israel. We know why you're supporting Tony Blair. We know why you're writing this or that about the Iraq war. We know who you are. And Nick used to say, but I'm not. I'm not Jewish. And Nick Cohen tells the story that after a certain time of this kind of relentless anti-Semitic abuse that he would get for writing press articles, he began to become ashamed of denying that he was Jewish. And in the end, he said, I'm Jewish now. And so that's the first thing I would say about Zionism, is that people should have their own Zionism, right? People should embrace whatever kind of politics of Zionism they like. All of the polling shows that most Jews identify in some way or another with their Israeli cousins. And it's not a surprise, you know. My family came from Germany. My dad's side came from Poland and Russia. It's pretty well chance that they happen to end up in, I think they were told that they were in New York and they got off the boat in London. It's pretty much chance that they ended up in London or in New York or in Israel. And my mum's cousins did end up in Israel via the concentration camps. So the idea that Jews are not involved in this kind of post-war Jewish reconstruction which happened in Israel, the idea that we're not involved in that is quite bizarre. But I don't want to talk about that with anti-Semites, right? I don't want to talk about my Zionism with anti-Semites. What I want to tell them is that your Zionism that you put onto me when you say I'm not a real sociologist, I'm not a real member of the Labour Party, but really I'm some kind of agent of Israeli imperialism, that definition of Zionism, which you put onto me in a hostile way against my will, is pernicious. So that's the only thing I want to just debate about Zionism with those people. Does that make any sense? I know it's a little bit complicated, but
yeah,
people want to say Zionism is really X. And if you push me, I'll say that the overwhelming majority of people's own Zionism is something which is entirely legitimate, is entirely within the tradition of democratic politics, and is not some kind of evil movement. But do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think, you know, the question that I have coming from that is, though, you know, most Jews would be Zionist in some fashion or consider themselves Zionist in some fashion. You know, these movements oftentimes take action against local Zionists and argue that it's not anti-Semitism. So instead, you know, if they're on college campuses, anybody who identifies as a Zionist is the opponent. You know, the whole Jewish community, you could be 90% of local Jews are considered some sort of Zionist, and then the whole Jewish community basically becomes the opponent.
Well, the thing is,
when we get to Jewish anti-Zionism, then we'll that's next too. But I want to deal with this first.
Jewish anti-Zionism is very important. But the thing is, we know that they're talking to us, right? There's a cafe in Toronto, in fact, I think it's fairly common, there's a hashtag Zionists not welcome, right? We know they're talking about us. And they say, no, no, we don't mean you, we mean the bad Zionists. We don't mean you, we mean the racist Zionists. We don't mean you, we mean the imperialists. But we know that we're being targeted here, right? Imagine you had a sign, I don't know, imagine you tried to ban reggae music, right? And then you said, but not everyone who likes reggae is black, and not everyone who's black likes reggae. Fine, but we would understand what was going on here. That's the thing, I think, is that there's a little catch there, that Jewish people know that they're being targeted. And even if it's just a matter of a hurdle that you have to go over, right? If they say to you, look, we don't hate Jews, we just hate Zionists, or we don't hate Jews, we just hate supporters of Netanyahu. And you turn up at your Labour Party meeting or your Hillel House or your student union and they say, so, are you a supporter of Netanyahu's apartheid politics? In other words, they give you the opportunity to disavow. Under those circumstances, are you going to disavow? Some people will, some people won't. This happened at a meeting of the South African Sociology Society, right? They were just about to do a panel about there was the movement, what were they called? The Occupy movements a few years ago. And there was an Israeli paper about the Occupy movement from Tel Aviv. And there were 4 people in this panel, and in walked the kind of chief sociologist and said, who is the Israeli? Point out the Israeli. And they pointed to the Israeli, and the Israeli said, I'm the Israeli. And he said, will you here and now disavow the apartheid politics of the Zionist entity? And he said, no. And I think I wouldn't either. So the thing is, even if there's just a hurdle, a suspicion, Jews come under suspicion that they might be Zionists, right? And they're given the opportunity to disavow. No, I'm not in favor of the occupation. No, I'm not in favor of this or that. No, I'm not in favor of the use of white phosphorus. But if those disavowals are made a kind of prerequisite for becoming part of the community, then I'm not part of that community.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so let's deal with people who identify as Jewish here, and who consider themselves anti-Zionist, or I might call in some ways they're Jewish anti-Jews. You know, people who are religious but oppose Jewish peoplehood, people who may be secular but oppose Jewish, more observantly religious people because of whatever reason. They might have some hostility. How does that fit in?
Okay, well, firstly, it's very important, right? So our experience of fighting against anti-Semitism in the trade unions and in the Labour Party is an experience of having to deal with people who stand up at every meeting and they begin the meeting by saying, I'm Jewish, and as a Jew, I'm here to tell you that boycotting Israel is the right thing to do. I'm here to tell you that Jeremy Corbyn and his politics is absolutely right. I'm here to tell you that those Zionists who say that there's an issue of anti-Semitism are lying. They're Tories, they're Trumpists, they're just trying to hurt the union, they're trying to hurt the left, right? So that is something that anyone who opposes anti-Semitism has to deal with. And I would suggest that we also sometimes have to deal with that on the right too, right? So when Giuliani makes his speech about the globalists and George Soros and the global liberal conspiracy, there are plenty of Jews in America who will say, as a Jew, I can tell you that there's nothing anti-Semitic about that. As a Jew, even though you know, Steve Bannon boasted about being the part of the alt-right, but Donald Trump's grandchildren are Jewish, and how could he therefore possibly be anti-Semitic? So the first thing we have to do is to divorce the politics from the identity, right? Normally, identity politics is a way of trying to draw attention to your own issue, right? And it came because very often, you know, white people in politics, men in politics, white people in academia, men in academia, didn't really notice the issues of women and people of color, for example, right? They didn't really notice, they didn't get it, they didn't understand racism. And they only understood it when black people and women began doing sociology and began participating in these movements. So historically, there is something important about experience. But what this does is it kind of reverses that. And you get Jews bearing witness against the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community who says, hang on, I can smell a rat with Jeremy Corbyn. There's a problem with Jeremy Corbyn. Look, we've got all of this evidence. We've got dossiers of cases. We've got an understanding of his politics. We know what he's been doing. He worked for the Iranian regime. He stands up for anti-Semites. This is what he does. But then you get some Jews who stand up and they bear witness against this overwhelming consensus in the Jewish community, and they say it's all lies. Now, firstly, this is an old phenomenon, right? That anti-Semitic movements have always made use of Jewish witnesses. Back to the Spanish Inquisition, there have always been Jewish witnesses against the Jews, right? Now, so that's one point. There's a kind of story that I think we need to understand is what is the meaning of anti-Zionism, right? What is the meaning of somebody who says that they hold a politics which makes an ism and makes a worldview out of being against Zionism? What is that all about? Now, you can go back to 100 years ago, and there was a problem of anti-Semitism in Eastern and Central Europe and in Russia. And there were actually three radical movements against this anti-Semitism. One was called Bundism, by which lefty Jews tried to find a new way of being Jewish, actually, a new kind of Jewish identity, because they didn't want to be shul Jews. They didn't want to be religious Jews, but they didn't want to lose their Jewishness either. And they wanted an identity politics by which they could oppose anti-Semitism. So there was the Bund and the Bundism. The second was Bolshevism, was a kind of universalist socialism which said what we need to do is to join up with all other humanity against all kinds of racism and all kinds of anti-Semitism, and we need to build a new world where I don't have to be Jewish anymore, where I can just be whoever I like, I can create my own identity, and I don't have to defend myself anymore. And then there were the Zionists who said, Europe is toxic and we need to get out. And we need to follow the politics that everybody else follows, which is that of national self-determination and creating a nation state by which we can defend our right to self-determination. Now, the truth is that none of those movements succeeded, right? Bolshevism, in fact, ended up supporting one of the 20th century totalitarianisms and didn't succeed in stopping the Holocaust. Bundism didn't succeed in stopping the Holocaust. Zionism didn't succeed in stopping the Holocaust. Why not? Because most Jews didn't go off on this utopian schlep to Palestine. They didn't do it. So at that time when all these, and the other Jews, but these were all the radical Jews. The other ones stayed in their shuls and stayed in their ghettos and carried on praying, and some of them just wanted to assimilate and become good Germans and good Russians and good Poles. And some of them wanted to get out and went to Britain or to America. So there were many ways of dealing with anti-Semitism, but those three were the kind of radical political ways. And they argued with each other. And some of them said, no, Zionism is a bad idea, Bundism is better, socialism is better, whatever. The thing is, they argued about ideas and they argued about politics, and that's fine. But many of the people today who identify as anti-Zionists also identify as kind of real macho Marxist historical materialists. And what they've missed is that the material history of Jewish life in Europe, in Russia, and across the Middle East is completely different from what it was when there were these arguments about Zionism, Bundism, and socialism. And what they kind of miss is the Holocaust, and what they kind of miss is the war of 1948. And they present themselves as these little kind of Yiddish-speaking nostalgists from 1920, but they're in Brooklyn in 2020. And it's not the same. And you will see that people who hate Israel very often refuse to call it Israel. They call it Zionism. And there's a reason why they talk about Zionism, is because when they talk about Zionism, it makes it sound like it's a political movement. And a movement can be right or wrong. You can support it or not support it. And you can say, I'm against Zionism. So they take this actually existing nation state, which is called Israel, and they pretend it's a political movement with which you can agree or disagree, right? France. Do you agree with France or do you disagree with France? It's a question without meaning, right? France exists. You can have a better France or a worse France. You can have France at war with Britain, which you might have shortly, or a France not at war with Britain, right? France can do good things or bad things, but the idea of setting up a worldview which is called anti-Francism is just silly. And so anti-Zionism in 2020 is not the same thing as anti-Zionism in 1920. And in order to make the Jews into something which can be obliterated, you have to transform them from a material reality into an idea. And once you've made them into an idea, then they can be an idea that we disagree with and we want to get rid of. So there are many things to say about anti-Zionism. Just one more thing I would say about Jewish anti-Zionism in particular, and that's this. Many Jews have a particular interest in Israel, right? Many of us are just interested. You know, many of us like Netanyahu, many of us hate Netanyahu. Many of us have a particular interest in the Israel-Palestine conflict. We want it solved. And many of us want the Palestinians to be free because they're kind of close to us in some sense, right? Not only because they're close to us, but because we think it's right and because we think it would be good for Israel too. But we have a particular Jewish interest in Israel and Palestine. That's understandable, right? So we will often go, out there into the world and talk about things that we have a particular interest in. But there's a particular thing that happens sometimes, which is that some Jews have a particular hatred for the crimes of Israel, right? The crimes of Israel real, or the crimes of Israel imagined, or the whole ideology which comes together through making a worldview out of the crimes of Israel. And sometimes Jews will become quite obsessive about Israel as though it was much more important than anything else in the world. And when they take that obsessive anti-Zionism, which is really an obsession about themselves, they take that out there into civil society and they say, I'm obsessed with the crimes of Israel and it motivates my whole life. And you, my trade union, should be also obsessed with the crimes of Israel and it should direct your whole life too. Then you have a problem. And one of the things that tends to happen is that it resonates. You know, the old slogan from the First World War, the old Bolshevik slogan was the main enemy is at home, right? And the English Bolsheviks, they said the main enemy is the English capitalist class, and the German Bolsheviks said the main enemy is the German capitalist class, and we shouldn't fight each other because the main enemy is at home. And sometimes Israeli anti-Zionists go to Britain and America and they say the main enemy is at home. And everyone looks at them and they say, you know what, I think you're right. I think the main enemy is at your home.
Yeah.
The main enemy is your home. The main enemy is Israel. I think you're right. And you can see how the politics of opposing Zionism in favor of Bundism or in favor of socialism or in favor of democracy or whatever becomes something completely different when Jews take it into civil society organizations and insist that they adopt this kind of worldview in the name of, well, in the name of liberation or whatever. But do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, I think this, we have a lot of conflicts here. I mean, I think to a certain extent, what ends up happening is that these people, a lot of people who have these perspectives are primarily political leftists who are just happen to be Jews, and their philosophy is not based in Judaism. It's not based in their Judaism often. It's based in their left-leaning politics. And
I'm not sure about that, because I think the obsession of Jewish anti-Zionists is quite specifically Jewish, right? They're not kind of equally worried about the democracy movement in Hong Kong or the democracy movement in anywhere else, or the oppression of any national minority anywhere else in the world. They're not obsessive about those things.
mm-hmm.
They're obsessive about their own Jewish issues. And that's fine, right? I don't mind if Jews want to be obsessive about Jewish issues. They're allowed. But when Jews take their own obsession into civil society organizations and encourage and demand that they base their whole culture and politics around opposition to Zionism, then we have a problem.
Well, I mean, I know a number of people who are not Jewish who basically have the same views and then just cite the Jews who are in their group. And I think a lot of the times the Jews in their group take on the anti-Zionist positions because they're in the group with the non-Jews, not because of their own Jewish perspective. It's somewhat circular. The focus on Israel becomes both because
I think that can happen
around them.
Although I think that sometimes our experience has been in Britain that the Jewish anti-Zionists they're not kind of useful idiots who are made use of by anti-Semites or even by Palestinians, but they are themselves the leaders, the vanguard of anti-Semitic politics. They're the ones that push it. They're the ones that teach Ken Livingstone that Hitler supported Zionism, right? They're the ones that teach Jeremy Corbyn that Rad Salah isn't a blood libeler or that it doesn't matter and the rest of it. So I think that Jewish anti-Zionism is not a kind of naive kind of victim. Well, it's not a kind of naive victim, but is a kind of leader. Although having said that, I do think there's a sense in which Jewish anti-Zionists are also people who have a keen awareness of their own risk. And maybe, I mean, I don't really want to get into their unconscious, but I do think that it is one way of dealing with a world in which there's anti-Semitism, right? If I can say there wouldn't be anti-Semitism if my fellow Jews behaved better. If only my fellow Jews behaved better, then there'd be no reason for anyone to hate us, right? I think, and that's quite an old emotion. I mean, there were people in Germany who really didn't like the Jews who came in from the East. There were Jews in London who didn't like the refugees who came from the continent. Mm-hmm. And I think this might even be a kind of universal feature of migrants, is that migrants are a little bit afraid of the new migrants who come in and who make them look bad. and by the way, this phenomenon is not only a Jewish phenomenon. I mean, there was quite a lot of talk about the minority vote that supported Donald Trump rising, right? And you kind of look naively and say, well, it's against your own interests. But, you know, people are complex, and people live in the world where racist and anti-Semitic ideas are kind of normal. And it would be strange if there weren't any Jews who were kind of attracted to that. And what they do then is that they mobilize their Jewish identity to give it kind of strength, right? They don't just say, I'm for abolishing the state of Israel. They say, as a Jew, I'm here to tell you that all these Jewish communities are lying, and that all these Jewish communities are right-wing, and I'm the real, genuine, authentic Jew. So that kind of mobilization of their identity in a way which is kind of opposite to the normal way of doing identity politics is quite hostile.
Yeah, and that gets us into kind of another category here, which is that some of those Jews are staunch anti-racists and want to lead in that direction and see Israel in that light also. So we have the whole anti-Semitism and race issue. And the perception of Jews as part of white oppressor imperialists, as you said earlier. And then kind of the whole erasure of MENA Jewry altogether, the Middle East, North African Jewry, because all Jews are white European imperialists, right? So talk about that for a minute.
Okay, well, there are a number of things that we could say. One of them, though, is this, that anti-Semitism is not the only racism that this kind of Stalinist anti-imperialist politics fails to care about, right? It also fails to care fundamentally about the oppression of the Tamils. It also fails to care about what was done to the African Asians in Kenya and Uganda. It also fails to care about what's happened to the Kurds in Iraq and in Iran. It also fails to care about what's happened to the Baha'i in Iran. In other words, any kind of racism that you can fit into this worldview, which says you have imperialism and anti-imperialism, and imperialism is racist and anti-imperialism is anti-racist. Anything you can fit into that framework works. But anyone who gets caught between the two is in real trouble, right? And the Jews often get caught between the forces of imperialism, or the rhetorics of imperialism and the rhetorics of anti-imperialism. The Kurds get caught between the rhetorics of imperialism and anti-imperialism. The African Asians were brought into Africa by imperialism and were then turned upon by the anti-imperialist movements. The Jews all over the Middle East, in the great cities of the Middle East, were turned upon by Arab nationalism in the name of anti-imperialism. And of course, yes, so on the whiteness of Jews, I think many things could be said. One of which is that it's true that some Jews in America, probably most Jews in America, are able to pass as white if they want to or if they need to. So remember, I said that race is constructed by racism, right? Now, if you're walking down a street and somebody constructs you as black in a hostile way and from outside, you might be in trouble. And it might be possible for some Jews to avoid being constructed as black in that circumstance. If so, good, right? But the first thing to say about that is that about half of the Jews of Israel do not pass as white and could not pass as white. So this idea that all Jews are white passing is wrong. And the other problem with that, I think, is that so you have a kind of white supremacism, right? A sort of white racist view, which never allowed Jews to pass, right? Which always said that not only are the inferior races threatening to us, but the very most threatening inferior race are the Jews. And you have this idea that it's the Jews who are responsible for polluting our lovely white nation with all these other nations. And if you look at the ideology which was held by the man who went into the synagogue at Pittsburgh, it's very clear that that's what he believed, right? So you have this white supremacism which has at certain times in history defined Jews not only as not white, but as the very antithesis of white. And of course, that's what happened in the Holocaust. It wasn't said that the Jews were oppressed or poor. It was said that the Jews were rich and the Jews were powerful and the Jews were a threat to ordinary, good, decent Germans. So white supremacism defines Jews as not white. At the same time, sometimes you have movements against white supremacism which refuse that racist definition of Jews as not white and which insist that Jews are white. So Jews get excluded from white society by white supremacy, and then they get excluded from the movements which oppose white supremacy as being white. And they get like kind of caught in the middle. The history of being Jewish in a way is being caught in the middle, is being caught by people who don't know whether you're powerful or powerless, by people who don't know whether you're a victim or a threat. So those issues are quite difficult. I mean, of course, in America in particular, there is this history of a kind of black Jewish alliance against racism, which some people are very proud of. It's also true that, that history is not as kind of ubiquitous as some anti-racists on both sides would like to believe. And at the same time, it's also true that there are people with black nationalist ideologies and other ideologies which have a particular focus on the evils of Jews. So look, the politics of race and racism are complicated. Race and racism is not just defined as we would like it, but are defined very often in ways that are hostile to us. And politically, what would I say? Politically, I would say that we should hang on to the idea that Jews benefit from a society in which we all oppose racism together. We should hang on to the idea of the, anti-racist alliance between Jews and other people who are threatened by racism. And we should understand that white supremacists and white racists will never accept Jews. So, but this issue goes back a long way in many very difficult ways. In South Africa, many of the Jewish refugees from Europe had to were faced with a choice of having to fight to be recognized as white or to be recognized against their will as black in South Africa. And of course, people faced with these kinds of impossible decisions make all sorts of impossible decisions. So I think it's complicated. I also think that, I think you said at some point that right at the beginning of this question, and I can't remember the context exactly, was the idea that this comes from the left only. And I think none of this comes from the left only. I think that there are people on the right too who kind of make the Jews into a sort of object of political symbolism. And very often you get a kind of right-wing pro-Zionism, which is a kind of mirror image of the left-wing anti-Zionism. And the reason it's a mirror image is because what they say about Zionism is the same. That Israel is this kind of symbol of white culture in the Middle East. It's this symbol of a security state which knows how to keep the Muslims down. And the difference is that people on the left have that view and they hate it, and people on the right have that view and they admire it. And this has always been true too. There has always been a thing called philo-Semitism, which has kind of the quote. My friend David Seymour will tell me off for forgetting who it was that said this, but the anti-Semites hate me as a Jew, and the philo-Semites love me as a Jew, but I wish none of them would see me as a Jew at all. Just see me as a person, and let my Jewishness be my business, really.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to describe people as the Jews, then you're already in trouble,
Yeah.
right? If you're just lumped into the Jews,
Yeah.
it is a big problem, no matter which direction it's coming from. Now, I definitely wouldn't say the objectifying of Jews is something that's limited to the left wing. That's, in fact, I would say it's more so even on the right wing. But I think. And we kind of skipped ahead a little bit. I mean, because populism and anti-Semitism dealing with, the philo-Semitism issue on the one hand, and because we had philo-Semitic politics coming from the right-wing governments in Hungary, was it? I mean, we have some of these things where they're hostile to everything. So we have on the one hand,
some of the government in Hungary, for example, is both philo-Semitic and anti-Semitic at the same time.
Yeah.
So they will, but actually, so is Jeremy Corbyn, both philo-Semitic and anti-Semitic at the same time. But the government in Hungary says, look, George Soros is laughing at you, this international Jewish financier who's trying to get you to vote against me. He's up there laughing at you. And at the same time, the Hungarian government is trying to make all sorts of deals with Israel. And of course, the Netanyahu is going along with it, which is really interesting piece of evidence about what I was saying earlier on, that the government of Israel is not Zionist or not Zionist. It's a government. It's a government of a state which thinks that it understands its own interest. And, my great-grandmother was a Zionist. She used to sit with a guitar around a fire doing Israeli dancing and dreaming about Zionism. But Israel today is a state, and it has its own interests, and its own interests are not necessarily about the good of the Jews of Hungary.
Yeah. So one of the things that's connected to this on kind of both directions is this idea of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and the tolerance of intolerance, or if you're dealing with even philo-Semitism in some cases, the tolerance of intolerance and anti-liberal values is part of this conversation.
I think that's true. For me, at the moment, politics is about defending democratic and liberal values. It's about defending the democratic state. It's about defending principles like the rule of law, like freedom of speech. It's about defending this is all very kind of 18th, 19th century, actually. This is right back to kind of the liberal politics of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, who I teach to our first years. But the distinction between civil society and the state, that we are free human beings and we're allowed to do whatever we like. We're allowed to follow our own interests, and we have the sphere of liberty. And we come together in the state where we think about the universal interest, and we make laws which maybe limit and guarantee our freedoms. I don't need to repeat to you the American Constitution, but it seems to me that those principles are being forgotten. That the idea that democracy is about more than one referendum at one moment of time in Britain. Democracy is more than elections. Democracy is about institutions. Democracy is about ways of thinking. Democracy is about teaching respect for the institutions of a democratic society. I mean, I can't, what's happening in the White House at the moment is really quite. You feel that what's happening in the White House isn't really kind of serious. But if it was serious, it would be very, very worrying. In other words, you feel that America is much too strong actually to be at risk of having its election stolen. But judging by the way that President Trump speaks, you kind of fear for that. And what he's trying to do is to create a feeling amongst millions of people that they have been stabbed in the back. And I mean, this goes right back to totalitarian politics, that totalitarian politics says you are being stabbed in the back by this elite or this establishment or big pharma, the big state, the people in the cities, the metropolitans, the cosmopolitans, the people who are fake. They pretend.
And it works for both parties. I mean, that's the other thing, is it's kind of both, populism is preaching this from both sides.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting actually, because it was only 2 or 3 weeks ago that the HRC report came out in Britain and Jeremy Corbyn got suspended from the Labour Party. And the moment he was suspended, things felt different. The moment he was suspended, then actually the key advisor to Boris Johnson, the one of the guys behind the whole Brexit movement, was sacked. And so actually not only Corbyn was kicked out, Donald Trump lost the election. And that was the moment when suddenly the Boris Johnson Brexit government began to look a bit silly. And it's interesting to think about the ways in which these populist movements feed on each other, and they feed each other. And for sure, Brexit would not have happened if Corbyn hadn't been the leader of the left in Britain. And by the same token, Corbyn wouldn't have happened if the Tory party hadn't been eaten up by this kind of new and strange nationalist movement. So I think you're right. I think that there's the danger of a left populism and a right populism, and I think they have quite a lot in common. And one of the things they do is to delegitimize democratic politics, because they both agree that the democratic state, the rule of law, freedom of speech, democratic way of equality, democratic equality of women and lesbians and gays and foreigners, they all agree that it's all kind of part of this part of this falsehood which is perpetrated by the liberal elite. And of course, I mean, it's slightly different. They emphasize slightly different elements of it, but fundamentally they build each other up and they squeeze those who fight for a democratic culture and a democratic state. And I have to say that it's very clear to me that what Jews need who live in America or who live in Britain, what Jews need is a strong, democratic, egalitarian state which guarantees our freedom, guarantees our liberty, and also guarantees the state which guarantees our liberty.
So yeah, I mean, as we're looking at this, what do we need? So what are the action items we need? I mean, how do we avoid this, continuing on in the same direction? The people who are trying to figure out how to get the Labor Party back where it needs to be, the people who are trying to get the Tories toward the middle and concerned about the country, keep the Democratic Party from being more like the Corbyn Labor Party and something more in the center, or the Republican Party that's not authoritarian, that's more on economics and that kind of thing. How do we get that back, or what do you predict is going to happen?
Well, I don't know. I mean, my job is kind of to worry about the worst things that can happen. And sometimes when those worries turn out to be right, it's very frightening. One of the things I've said is that what we need to do is to rediscover democracy, to rediscover that. I mean, I kind of raised the slogan, make democracy sexy again, right? Because what is sexy are these radical critiques, what is sexy are the people who say, I won't be taken in by this nonsense, and you know, really what's going on is X, Y, and Z, and I'm not naive, and what we need to hold on to is the distinction between critique and contempt. So of course our democracy is not perfect, and of course we can have a critical engagement with our democracy, or a critical engagement with the media, with freedom of speech, critical engagement with law and how it works, critical engagement with policing, critical engagement with our commitments against racism, of course. But when that becomes contempt, when the law becomes nothing but a trick to keep us down, and Parliament becomes nothing but something to fool us, and the police becomes nothing but an arm of the racist state, and we need to be very careful, because we need to hold on to rational critique without being drawn in by the excitement of radical contempt. That's what I think.
Okay. Okay. Well, and so I think, you know, we had a conversation about all sorts of different things, and everybody should go out and get the book. Definitely, Contemporary Left Antisemitism by David Hirsh. It's a great book. I think you'll enjoy reading it if you get it. What conclusions do you want to offer today? What do you think people should be thinking about based on all this right now?
I don't know. I think I think I've been talking a long time, and I think I'll come back to that in a minute. I would also invite people to follow me on Twitter and Facebook, and there's lots of things I've written that are online about all this stuff. And also, if you Google the Engage website, engageonline.org.uk, but just Google Engage Online and anti-Semitism and you'll find it. I don't know. You just invited me to finish off with some brilliant kind of summing up, and the brilliant summing up is that I don't know. I'm still afraid. I think things look a little better than they did this time last year. But it's kind of interesting, because both in Britain and in America, it looks like populism is being pushed back from the very mainstream back towards the margins. And this is a good thing. What frightens me is that the thing that is on the margins again is stronger on the margins than it used to be. And I think that there are many, many people who will have learnt that, you know, that making America great again was stopped by a fraudulent election, or that making socialism in Britain was stopped by the Jews and the Zionists, or that our path to utopian Brexit was stopped by foreigners and by the liberal elite and by the Europeans and the French and the Germans, whatever it is. So I think things are looking up, because I think it's really important that, you know, Trump lost, Corbyn lost, Boris Johnson looks a little precarious, at least with his most radical version. Populism is still very strong in Poland and in Hungary, and there are big populists. It lost in Italy too, by the way. It also lost in France. Marine Le Pen lost. But, you know, in any of these places, it can resurge again. So I would say, you know, there's some good news. But the bad news is that these movements are consolidating, each with their own stab in the back myth, each with their own myth that says our path to utopia was stopped by this cosmopolitan liberal elite, and next time we're not going to be so nice to them. That's the scary bit. But the good news is, you know, is that there have been some victories for anti-populist politics recently, and I'm pleased about that.
Well, and we know also from the conversation that anti-Semitism hasn't gone away. We still have anti-Semitism present in a lot of different ways, and
That's true.
we need
I thought
to
when
keep
we were
it there.
fighting left anti-Semitism in the Union, I thought it was finished on the right, and I was wrong. It wasn't finished in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia. It wasn't finished, and this kind of anti-liberal, anti-metropolitan, cosmopolitan, elite hatred for the educated and for the people who live in the cities. This lives on, and this is certainly open to an anti-Semitic interpretation. So I was wrong about that right-wing anti-Semitism was finished, but it hasn't quite moved into the mainstream yet either. I mean, the Donald Trump people haven't been particularly anti-Semitic, only on the kind of edges of some of the things that they've said. But there's an opening for it.
Okay. Well, I think we had a wonderful conversation over almost 2 hours here.
I think it must be just you and me left, honestly.
We covered. No, there's been people and people who are interested in the recording. So I will post the recording. It'll be on Facebook and it'll also be on YouTube. And you'll be able to share it with whoever you want and present it in whatever way you want. I think it's been a good conversation, and I think we will certainly, you and I'll keep in touch, and I know that there'll be more conversations about anti-Semitism to come because unfortunately it's not gone. And we also have to, I think, concern ourselves that we're dealing with a pendulum that's going to swing back and forth as opposed to one that's here. I think it's still moving pretty hard. And just because things are where they are right now doesn't mean they're going to stay there very long. So we have to be concerned. The world can change pretty quickly, and educating ourselves and understanding these things is very important. And I think your book goes a long way to helping people understand it. So really appreciate that. Really appreciate the conversation. Thank you for joining me, and I'm sure the people online have really enjoyed the conversation as well.
Thanks very, very much.
You're welcome. Bye, David.
Bye-bye.